Está directamente con Zoom. Tutores.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por venir y por lo que nos siguen a través de YouTube. Hoy es un honor para mí y un placer tener al profesor invitado Paolo Barberi, que nos va a dar una conferencia. Él iba a venir en el 2020 y luego la pandemia postergó esta visita, así que por suerte se pudo reorganizar y hacerla efectiva hoy. Él hoy nos va a dar una conferencia que es Functional Biodiversity and Agro-Ecosystem Services. La conferencia se va a dictar en inglés. Si bien Paolo entiende y habla bastante bien el español, es mucho más relajado para él dar la charla en inglés, pero luego para las preguntas y para la discusión posterior, siéntense en libertad de formular preguntas en español y si hay algún inconveniente, haremos las aclaraciones que correspondan. Bueno, Paolo Barberi es profesor de agronomía y cultivos extensivos, jefe del grupo de agroecología, ex coordinador del Programa Internacional de Doctorado en Agrobiodiversidad, del Centro de Ciencia de las Plantas de la Escuela Superior de Santa Ana, Pisa, Italia. Y va a estar unos días aquí dando charlas y también participando de reuniones con aquellos que estén interesados en interactuar con él. Así que los dejo en compañía de Paolo y nuevamente muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Bueno, muchas gracias y bienvenidos a todos. Lo siento, pero mi español no es bastante bueno para tener una charla de científico. Bueno, sería mucho, puede ser que un problema para mí, pero como él va, no hay ningún problema si prefieren poner preguntas en español, creo que vamos a entender utilizando cualquier tipo de web. Es un placer muy grande para mí de volver aquí, después de 17 años, después de un taller muy interesante que sobre todo organizó sobre la biodiversidad y nosotros tenía la posibilidad de ver cómo se desarrolló ese tema en nuestro grupo de investigación. Now I shift to English, probably for you as well. So that's the topic of my talk, and pretty much what we are working on in our research group. By the way, if you feel like interrupt me, you can do it anytime, no problem. So let's find a way to make this as interactive as possible, right? Let's not keep it too short. And welcome also to the people who are attending online. I don't know if they can ask questions or
No,
people online.
no.
Complicated. So, just an outline. Outline of my talk. I will contextualize a little bit the topic we are working on, considering the challenges that everyone is facing in this historical moment. Okay, and I will introduce, also going back to what we were discussing many years ago, the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity. Are they friends or are they foes? There is always some discussion on this. Nevertheless, there is recent scientific evidence, very strong scientific evidence, suggesting that agriculture diversification. Diversification of agricultural system can really be the key for improving sustainability of agriculture worldwide. And I will develop a little bit something of this. And to be more specific, there is a subset of agrobiodiversity, what we call functional agrobiodiversity, which is basically the most important part through which we can adjust our agricultural systems, cropping system in order to improve. And I will define some types of functional agrobiodiversity, mainly not just to make the theoretical part very heavy, but just to let you understand that there are several opportunities to utilize agrobiodiversity to improve the provision of consistent service in agriculture. And I will give you some examples from our research on what actually can be achieved if we try to implement this. And finally, I will put some conclusion and perspectives also with the purpose of igniting a little bit the discussion after my talk. You may be familiar with this type of graph. This is the most recent one, which was published just a couple of months ago. This is a graphical representation developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden, showing at the global level where and in which type of the issues we have already surpassed the capacity of our planet to withstand what we are doing. So all these sectors represent different important issues related to the health of our planet, like ozone depletion, acidification of the ocean, freshwater change, land system change, biosphere integrity. Basically, you can consider biodiversity as part of what's called here biosphere integrity, climate change, invasive species, and so on. So whenever for one of these sectors, the area, the red area is going beyond this circle here, it means that we have already gone beyond the limits of our planet to withstand basically what we are doing. So for example, here we have biogeochemical cycle, means that on what concerns nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, globally, and of course agriculture has a lot to do with these, we have already gone much beyond the capacity of our planet to sustain a viable, way of dealing with this problem. As well with biodiversity, both genetic and functional biodiversity. We are eroding biodiversity much beyond the capacity of the planet to regenerate itself for this specific issue, and as well climate change. There is also a positive message from this graph, and that is if humans decide to intervene seriously, try to revert the situation, they can achieve important goals. And this is the case, for example, of the stratospheric ozone layer depletion. You may remember that 30 years ago, this was a big issue, environmental issue, but due, for example, to the ban of sprays, which were directly affecting the ozone layer, the situation was reverted up to the point at which, for this specific issue, we are within the limits of safe, what is called the safe operating space. So I think that's a good news, and this will tell us that if we understand how to revert the trend, we should improve, really achieve this. And about climate change, I think this is the most striking picture, which is indicating the exponential growth of extreme climate events at the global level, any type of event, from floods to drought to fires, etc., which is one of the most striking direct consequences of climate change. This is certainly contributing to the fact that the climate change boundary that we're seeing is already beyond the same operational limits, and it is something that always makes me think, because I think that my country, but also in other countries, we always have to repeat the same story and convince people that climate change does exist. Right? And it's not just a scientific construct. But yeah, that's not necessarily easy. This is a graph that is showing that whenever we are talking about how agricultural food systems influence climate change, we should consider not just what the farmer is doing in their fields, but also the consequences at the overall food system level. This is a study which was done through LCA, probably a familiar life cycle analysis. Yes, it's a method, indicator-based method to estimate the impact of several activities, including agricultural and systems. And we did this study by comparing 20 different systems for tomato fresh consumption, that was based on a Kafkani regional scale. And these 20 systems were given by the combination of 4 production systems, namely organic or integrated tomato production either in the field or in the greenhouse, and 5 handling and trade systems. So from a very local type of trading system, so regionally produced tomatoes sold locally through short supply chain type of systems, up to a much longer type of food chain, like, for example, packing tomato, selling them through supermarket chains after traveling from the place of production to the place of delivery. So the light blue and the dark blue areas, these graph represent the estimates of the CO2 emissions related to the different 20 production systems, dividing them by the productive part, which is the light blue part of the graph, and what happens after you have collected tomato, which is the dark blue part. So you see that without getting into the very details, there are large differences in terms of estimate of how much CO2 emissions are produced per kilo of tomato. And if we compare, how can I go back to the previous slide? Okay. It's okay. If we compare the two extreme cases, so the one with the least and the one with the worst emissions, we can see something interesting, that both of them are organically produced tomato, but they are completely different, not just from the point of view of the type of practices that are used, but of the type of the whole system. One is what we can call an agroecological system par excellence, which means tomato grown in the field, sold, unpacked in the same region where it is produced and through a very short supply chain, contributing to the very low degree of emissions after harvest. The other one is a very different type of organic tomato. It's grown in the greenhouse, comes from outside the region where it's sold, and it is packed and sold through a supermarket type chain. And all these operations after harvest contribute quite a lot to the overall estimate of CO2 emission. So that if you compare the actual amount, you have a difference of at least 5-fold. So the second system is emitting a unit of produce 5-fold in terms of CO2 compared to the first system. This is not to say that you should get rid of this system and you should only endorse this, but it's just a way by which you can make people aware that when we're talking about the contribution of agriculture and food system to climate change, to CO2 emissions in this case, you should not stop at the farm gate. You should consider the whole food system, because this can mean a lot. And this would be, at least for those consumers who are sensitive to this kind of things, it would be a way to decide what type of production they would actually buy. So This is the general context. What's going on in the European Union? Quite a lot of things. There is, in this moment, a general political program from the present European Commission. You may know that in Europe, we have 27 countries which are getting together, the European Union. And much of the politics regarding economy, environment, but also research, education, and others are decided at the European community level and then are applied at the individual member state level. Now, there is a general, very important and innovative political program, which is called the European Green Deal, which has the objective by 2030 to make all European economy greener, not just agriculture, but every economic sector in Europe. And a lot of specific strategies have been developed to make it happen. For what concerns agriculture, there are two specific strategies. One is called the Farm to Fork strategy, and the other, the biodiversity strategy for 2030, that are particularly relevant. What do they, what kind of objective do they have? For example, in the Farm to Fork strategy, there is the objective to reduce by 50% the usage of pesticides and also the usage of the most environmentally harmful pesticides by 2030. To reduce by 25% compared to the starting point the amount of nitrogen which is used as fertilizer, and to transform 25%, this is a very ambitious objective, that by 2030, 25% of the total European agricultural area should be managed under organic farming conditions, 1/4 of total European land. This is a very ambitious goal, but if you look at Italy, for example, we are already close to 20%. So we are not very far from this objective. And there are other countries like Austria, which are even beyond 30% of the total agricultural area under organic farming. And this is because organic farming is considered one appropriate method to meet the overall goal of the Green Deal. And for us as researchers, this implies that there are enormous opportunities for funding. There is a general research program which is called Horizon Europe, the present one, which includes a lot of funding for this type of research. Which should find out solution and understand a better way the mechanisms behind the greener type of agriculture. So it's an important historical moment, right? So let's see what happens next year, because next year we are going to have the European elections, which will elect the new European Commission, and let's see if we will continue on the same trend. But let's say that many trends are already ongoing, so the new European Commission will not be able to completely stop this trend. You're probably familiar with this graph. This is the so-called wheel of ecosystem services, which is one of the major products of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a large-scale endeavor of many scientists all over the world, about 50 years ago, 80 years ago. And the four types of ecosystem services, regional, regulated support, and cultural, is actually what we need to promote in sustainable agriculture system. And biodiversity has a lot to do with this. But it's important to understand which elements of biodiversity in our ecosystem can actually, if implemented or if managed appropriately, improve the provision of these type of ecosystem services. So it's not any longer that ecosystem services is something for environmentalists and is completely detached from agriculture production. Two things, at least in Europe, are merging very clearly, and it's an opportunity to go use this as a concept to go to work with sustainable agriculture. moment of patience. Maybe I think it's working, so maybe I should. Or, third one.
Sí, igual esa es la que estamos buscando, ¿no? Esa, sí, pero debería estar en la opción equivocada. Y bueno, si no la otra opción es que se vea con el paquete. Se vea, ¿no? Ah, no. Lo probaron. Sorry, it's in your name. It is. Go ahead. Right. Go through all the slides and whatever.
Yes, sorry.
Now,
Okay, sorry for the technical problem. So we can resume the report. So, right, so the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity is sometimes contradictory. If you look at the scientific literature, you can basically divide the papers on this subject in two categories. There is one group of papers in which the goal is to manage agriculture in order to support biodiversity, right? Plants, microorganisms, sectors, whatever. The organisms living in an agro-system. Whereas there is another group of paper which is apparently using the opposite approach. So how to manage and select biodiversity in an agro-ecosystem in such a way to support agricultural production. It is what I call A for B or B for A. Right? But as a matter of fact, okay, if we are using an ecosystem service terminology, the first approach is basically has the goal to provide or promote ecosystem services that are not necessarily related to cultural production. So we have valuable plant species or microorganisms or birds or other type of animals who are living in an ecosystem. That's the goal, right? How to manage agriculture in order to protect its species. And this is basically has to do with the so-called regulating cultural type of service. The other approach, the B4A approach, instead, is more focused on the provisioning and supporting service. So production is important. So how can we optimize and improve production quantity and quality through the better use of biodiversity? So that's basically the approach. But the good news, in my opinion, is that there is no contradiction between the two goals. We can actually manage agriculture in such a way to obtain both types of goals. And the agroecological approach to management was actually this type of approach. So how can we reduce through a better use of biodiversity, the use of external inputs, at the same time protecting the biodiversity, which is present in our system. So that's the goal. It seems very difficult, it seems sometimes impossible, it is not impossible. That's what evidence is showing. And some of the most striking evidence, in my opinion, is given by this paper. This paper is has been written and published 3 years ago, and it's a joint endeavor of a group of interdisciplinary scientists that have been published in Science Advances. Some of you may be familiar with this paper. It's a second level meta-analysis, which means it's a meta-analysis of meta-analysis, right? So if you believe that meta-analyses are the top type of quality type of scientific evidence, a meta-analysis of meta-analysis should be even higher than that. But okay, what is this paper focused on? You haven't yet read it. I do recommend reading because it's a very bright and striking paper. So they have selected meta-analysis focused on the comparison between diversified and non-diversified systems, and I will explain later what they mean by diversified systems, in the same type of environment, so that there are no local conditions that would influence the outcome. And they have seen in how many cases the diversified system is promoting or increasing the yield of target crop, and at the same time promoted the better expression of other ecosystem services like those that you see here indicated in the box. General biodiversity, pollination, pest control, water regulation, nutrient cycling, etc. Right? So every dot here in this diagram represents a case, right? A study in which this type of comparison has been done. And this is a very elegant way of synthesizing the results of this meta-analysis in this 4 quadrants. And basically all the dots that are included in the first quadrant of the graph are the studies demonstrating that a diversified type of system at the same time increases compared to the non-diversified system the yield of crop, and at the same time it also increases the provision of other type of ecosystem services. The colors represent a different type of services. It is striking to note that in 63% of the cases, there is a win-win situation. So agricultural diversification at the same time increases production and increases the provision of other ecosystem services. The opposite situation, so where diversification does not pay off, represent only 10% of cases here, in this part of the graph. And then there are two other situations, two types of trade-offs. There could be cases in which diversification increases production but penalizes the provision of other type of services, this series of dots here, or the opposite. So you do have a higher provision of services, but you have a yield penalty with the diversified system. And this later case represents only 50% of the total sample. And I want to stress this because up to very few years ago, the way, for example, the European agricultural policy was organized was in such a way to provide subsidies to farmers willing to diversify their cropping system, considering that they will lose yield anyway. Scientific evidence demonstrates that this is not necessarily the case. Rather, this is the case in a minority of situations. And I found this article really excellent, and I know personally some of the authors, and I can tell you that this is really a dream team of researchers, right? So we can trust them. And this is what they mean by cropping system diversification at this time. So these are the different measures or technical solutions that were included in these meta-analysis. So usage of different organic amendments like manure, compost, or mulches, reduced tillage versus conventional tillage, crop diversification, so a more diversified crop rotation or the inclusion of cover crops versus a more simplified system. Non-crop diversification, which means what is around the cultivated field, hedgerows, other type of semi-natural habitats, and so on. Inoculation of, for example, mycorrhizae, right, as a way to improve diversity and functionality of the soil, and organic farming as a standalone type of management system. So basically, whenever you see that the majority of a bar graph is green, it means that there is a higher proportion of studies that are showing a positive, significantly positive effect of diversification versus no diversification. The opposite case is the red part of the graph. The gray areas are the situation of equivalence, basically, right? Not clear difference between diversified and non-diversified. So you see that in the majority of cases, the green areas are more than the red, so the gray areas. Meaning, it's an extra more detailed explanation of what was shown in the previous graph, that diversification does promote the provision of consistent services. Don't be fooled by the size of the bars. The larger or smaller size of the bar is just due to the fact that for some of these practices, there are more studies, and for others, there are less studies. This is why, for example, here you have lower bars than here, right? What is important to look at is the relative comparison of the green versus red versus gray areas. So this is, I think, a very encouraging and important piece of information. And it has been 1 year later, in 2021, another meta-analysis published by French colleagues showing more or less the same type of event. I'm not going into details, but the interesting additional information that you can find in this second meta-analysis, if you want, I think you can retrieve them, but if not, I can send them if you're interested, right? Is that you can partition some specific practices within some systems, like agroforestry systems, for example, and see which of the specific practices within agroforestry is yielding the best results. So, for example, in terms of the promotion of associated biodiversity in agro-ecosystem, you see that shaded perennial crops, agroforestry parklands, and almond cropping are yielding generally better results than classical silvopasture agroforestry systems. So you can investigate even further in which type of practice associated with a special type of system can deliver more services. So diversity. Diversity is important. Diversity is important at any spatial scale, field scale, farm scale, at the territorial scale, and at the regional scale. This is a message to policymakers who have the power to influence agricultural management at the level of the region. So we know that there is potential. Biodiversity can potentially deliver agro-ecosystem functions or services. It is also clear, it seems trivial, but it's important to mention this, that not all biodiversity in an agro-ecosystem is useful. I doubt that you could convince the farmer that agricultural pests or diseases, even though they are part of agricultural biodiversity, are something worth being protected, right? So this is why we can and should distinguish between those elements with a positive, negative, or neutral value in terms of an agro-ecosystem. So we need to understand and select the useful, we call it the functional part of biodiversity, and utilize it in the best possible way, turn it into improved agricultural practices at any spatial scale in such a way to improve the overall performance of our system. And this can be done if we use a so-called trait-based approach. What do we mean by a trait-based approach? Let's come to this in a while. Let's first give some definition, because there is a little bit of confusion in scientific definition when it comes to this issue. We have biofunctionality and functional biodiversity. Some people tend to use them as synonyms, but they're not. And I will try to explain why. What is biofunctionality? Biofunctionality is just a service or an ecological function which is associated to the presence of a set of organisms. For example, if I say ladybirds predate aphids, I'm not saying anything new. Everyone knows that ladybirds predate aphids, right? And this is associated to the so-called biological pest control function or service, right? That can be given by ladybirds. But can we consider upon this statement ladybirds as an example of functional agrobiodiversity? Not quite yet. They are just a biofunctional group. And this is because I'm not saying anything about the importance of diversity within the group of ladybirds or similar organisms able to predate aphid in delivering the biological pest control service. Nothing wrong if you have ladybirds around, but they are at the moment just a biofunction. They are able to predate aphids, therefore it's a biological pest control function. So what is the difference then between biofunctionality and functional agrobiodiversity? Functional agrobiodiversity, in our concept, is when the degree of service provision is associated to the diversity in the functional group. So if I pick up the previous sentence and I change it a little bit, and I say, ladybirds predate aphids. A higher number of ladybird species exert a higher number of predation. Okay, if I can demonstrate that this is true, I'm still talking about biological pest control, same service as before. But if I can demonstrate that this is actually true, this is an example of functional biodiversity. So it is not just the presence of ladybirds which matters; it is also the diversity within ladybirds that also matters more. So it helps you reach more in terms of biological pest control. And this is related to our own definition of functional biodiversity. We engaged into writing this paper not to try to reinvent the wheel, because you can find many definitions of functional biodiversity in the literature, but we were not very happy about them in terms of application in the context of agricultural system. So in our definition, functional biodiversity is a subset of total biodiversity composed of group of elements, what we call the functional groups, and they can be at any level and any spatial scale, right? The important thing is that all these elements have in common the possibility of delivering a service, right? In terms of biological pest control, this could be related to the presence of ladybirds, for example, but also to the presence or the typology of hedgerows, because they can be habitats that can support the presence or the development of biological pest control agents, right? And this could also be related to, from the point of view of management, to the deliberate introduction of some biological control agents, for example, which is another way of trying to reach the same goal. So we put all these together across agrobiodiversity levels and types, and we create this functional group. Then, if you can demonstrate that the diversity within this functional group is important to improve the provision of services, that's the proof that functional biodiversity does matter. And this is not always the case. We don't have to think that whenever the case, the more diversity you have, the better it is in terms of provision of service. And this is what I want to tell you with some of the examples that I'm going to show you later, taken from our research. But first, allow me the last theoretical step, which is a finer definition of the types of functional agrobiodiversity that can be seen and implemented in agro system. We identify three types or three cases. One is what we call functional identity. What does it mean? It means that the best effect in terms of service provision is given by the presence of a set of homogeneous phenotypic traits that could be possessed by a single element, a cover crop, for example. You have a very effective cover crop in controlling the weeds. What kind of traits are associated with this? The smothering effect, the biomass, the height. You can name a lot of traits that are potentially associated with this. This could be the best case. So there are cases in which choosing the best single element for a given target service is better than diversifying the, for example, number of species constituting the cover crop. This case is what we call a functional identity. So it's the identity of the functional element which matters more than the diversity within the functional group. If it sounds too awkward, just stop. I'll try to use simpler terms, right? But I think it will be clear with the examples, right? Second case, that's a classical case which occurs in intercropping, for example. Anyone studying or knowing intercropping knows that intercropping, to be successful, needs to take into account the complementarity of use of resources between the different, usually two crop species, right? And this is related to the complementarity of traits as well. So, is it better to have one tall and one short plant in intercropping, or both of them that are tall or short? What would you think? One short and one tall. That's complementary, right? Because you can have, for example, for radiation interception, that the combination of growing one taller crop and a shorter crop is better intercepting globally the incoming radiation than having two short or two tall crops, which might end up in competition for light, by the way, right? And the same is true if you would observe what happens below ground, right? What type of root systems are better for intercropping? One shallow-rooted and one deep-rooted crop, or both shallow-rooted or both deep-rooted? It is, again, a combination of different traits, root traits in this case, which is the best effect. This is something, not saying anything new, this is very clear from many years in intercropping studies, but we can reprise this approach from the point of view of the complementarity of traits that we are engaging in a diversified system. And we have a special case that we have called functional diversity in strict sense, where the effect is given by the genetic heterogeneity between a single crop species. I will show you some special cases on which we are working on, related to cereals like wheat. This means that compared to the classical homogeneous varieties of wheat, for example, that most farmers grow, you could use populations of wheat plant. It's still wheat, still the same species, but there is a high level of genetic diversity within the crop stack. So some plants are taller, some are shorter, some are old, some are not old. So there is a combination of different morphological and physiological traits. And what is the purpose of this? You can construct these. These are called evolutionary populations. It's an interesting approach to the usage of genetic diversity to achieve ecosystem services and other type of goals. The idea is that if you have a combination of different morphological and physiological traits within the same population, this population will be better able to cope, for example, with climate change or unpredictable seasons. You have a dry season, you have a wet season next. If you don't have in your wheat population the presence of individuals that are able to cope better with drier or wetter conditions, well, it's just a matter of luck, right? So you have a season which is allow your variety to perform in the best possible way, then you're lucky. Otherwise, you will lose quite a lot of production. Playing with the diversity of genes within the same population allows you to buffer the effect of climatic fluctuation, so that in the end you may not reach the ultimate top yield level, but you stabilize yield across years, which is a very interesting approach, especially in times of climate change, in which growing season become more and more unpredictable from the point of view of precipitation, temperature, issues. So that's the idea. I will give you an example later. So there are various ways through which we can implement and make use of functional biodiversity. This is a general scheme from a group, a very strong group of plant ecologists in France. They have defined two types of traits for plants that they call response and effect traits. The response traits are those possessed by individual plants that make them able to survive in a given environment. In every environment, and even more so in the agricultural environment, you have disturbances, right? Given by weather conditions, but in agriculture also given by management, right? So which plants are able, weeds, for example, are able to survive at the end of the season? Those that have the right set of traits that allow them to respond positively to the set of disturbances given by the combination of seasonal times management issues. Okay, either they survive or they don't survive. If they survive, they become part of the plant community, with community, for example, that is present in agriculture. And that can be described by richness, composition, interaction, and so on. Right? Part of the traits of this plant can also be important to deliver ecosystem services. This is a rather novel view of looking at weeds. Weeds are not necessarily negative, right? They can provide something good. If you have a bare soil, and if you have a lot of rain, bare soil is conducive to a lot of erosion, right? If you have a plant cover, and this plant could as well be what we call weeds, right? You can exploit this presence of weeds, so-called, in such a way that they will reduce soil erosion. Or weeds can also be important as flower resources for pollinators, right? Or for agents of biological pest control. So why neglecting this, right? And always consider weeds as a negative element in our system. So if we can demonstrate that these plants have some traits that can deliver some ecosystem services, this is what we call the effect traits, right? Floral resources, nectar, or pollen resources, right? they do have this. They are potentially able to deliver ecosystem services, pollination. So, in the more, let's say, recent views, basically the response and the effect trace are somehow intermingled. Right? So you can have at the same time response trace that can also be effect trace. So it depends on the single situation. But I think this is a nice theoretical scheme to understand what's behind the trait-based approach to functional diversity. Here you have some potential traits or functional markers, and they are called these papers, related to the different parts of the plant part of the plant. So the functional absorption of nutrients, of water, of camouflages, or underground for competition are related to some important root traits like root density, root diameter, root length, etc. So these are the traits that can make this plant better as a competitor or as a give it a better opportunity to absorb nutrients in the water. And this is just kind of word cloud of what are usually considered the most important plant traits, right? Both response and effect traits. This area, growth forming, phenology type, specific area, etc. This can vary depending on the situation, but it is more or less what we are talking about. So, basically, knowing this, in an agroecological approach to crop production, we need to understand and select the attributes or effect traits that are most likely providing the target agroecosystem services. This is true for plants, but can also be true for soil, or microorganisms, or insects, or whatever, any type of organism living in an agroecosystem. We have developed a four-step approach. I'm not going into the details, but if you're interested, I can circulate a paper which we are explaining this four-step approach as a way to, in any type of situation, go step by step in understanding and selecting what are the best traits in order to comply with a target objective. And so let's see finally some examples of what we work on in this framework. We work on many things at the research. We work on genetic biodiversity, different crop cultivar mixtures for mixing different cultivars of the same species, not just at random, but after selecting the right traits. So that is our approach. That's why this long introduction might be most important to understand how we can actually utilize this to make it practical research and in practice. And we work on evolutionary populations or composite cross populations, especially of cereals, in which you start by creating hybrids, basically. So you create a population by selecting the number of parentals, female and male, that have some specific traits, like resistance to drought, ability to extract nutrients, resistant to diseases, whatever you consider relevant for your specific agroecosystem can deliver the traits that are important. Then you make some crosses, and you can understand that for a crop like wheat, this is rather complicated, well, tedious more than complicated. You have to open the flower, take the pollen of the donor mother, and pollinate the male donor pollen and pollinate the mother, so to say. In the end, after a series of manual crosses, you obtain the initial population. Then you grow it in a target environment, and at the end of the first year, you save part of the seeds and you reuse it for cultivation in the same target environment in the next season. And over and over and over, year after year. So this is driving a process of segregation of the traits that you have included artificially in the initial population. And what you observe typically after 7 or 8 years of this segregation process, you have a stability of expression of the traits. So you have created theoretically the best population adapted to a target environment. So this is a completely different approach to breeding, for example, compared to classical breeding, in which you focus on a set of very precise traits, and you assume that those traits, or the variety that possesses those traits, will perform well in every type of environment, right? So this is basically to try an evolutionary process within a weak population to make it as adapted as possible to a given environment. This is becoming common in organic farming, for example, in Europe, right? But not just in organic farming. We work on species biodiversity, different crop rotation, crop sequences, cover crops and mulches, dead mulches, living mulches, intercropping, different types of cropping. And we also work on habitat biodiversity, so at the higher scale level, like field margin, hedgerows, other semi-natural habitats. So I have tried to select some examples of these across the 3 talks that I'm going to give here at home. I'm not packing everything today, right? So just to give you an overview of what you can get out of this. So I will give you then briefly 3 examples from our study related to the topic of today's talk. One example of service given by biofunctionality. Remember, biofunctionality is just related to the presence of a functional, right? Not the diversity of functional. Another case in which this service is given by functional identity, so the right traits possessed by an element. And one example of service given by functional, what we call functional composition, so complementarity of different traits. Let's start with the first case, which is related to the paper that we published some time ago. The aim of this research was to study the effect of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, right? Both the presence and the diversity of mycorrhiza on the growth of sunflower, the target crop, and the suppression of weeds, right? So what is the role that mycorrhiza can play in shifting or adjusting crop weed competition? Do they have a role? You know that mycorrhiza are thought to have multiple roles. Yes, they're important, considered to be an important component of the soil. They can also have a role in shifting with crop competition. So the research hypothesis were that the presence of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi indeed promote the growth of sunflower, because sunflower is responsive to the presence of mycorrhiza. It's a so-called mycorrhizal species. And just because of this, sunflower would benefit from the presence of mycorrhiza and become more competitive against the weeds. So that was the idea. If we can demonstrate this, this is just a biofunctionality effect. So we are focusing on the presence and not the diversity of mycorrhiza. But we also hypothesized that these effects could be further enhanced by the diversity of mycorrhizal fungi included in soil. So if we demonstrate this would be the demonstration of a functional biodiversity effect. So it's not just the presence of mycorrhiza, its presence, but also diversity. Okay. So we established a pot experiment in which we had 3 species of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. We had 6 species of weeds, typical of spring-summer crops in Mediterranean Europe, 3 grasses and 3 dicotyledonous species. And we had sunflower as the target crop. We had 9 treatments, 5 treatments in which sunflower was combined with all the 6 species of weeds in the same pots, plus the first, second, third species of mycorrhiza, plus all the 3 species of mycorrhiza together, or with no mycorrhiza. 2 additional treatments had only sunflower without the weeds, plus or minus the 3 mycorrhizal species. And we had 2 complementary treatments where weeds without sunflower were grown with or without the presence of mycorrhizal species. in this graph, you see an extreme synthesis of the results, right? So this is the total with biomass in grams per pot. And you can observe first an interesting effect that if weeds are grown without the presence of sunflowers, so with no competition with the crop, they suffer from the presence of mycorrhizal added to the soil substrate. So if they are in the presence of mycorrhiza, the wheat biomass is reduced by about 25% compared to the case in which weeds are grown without the presence of mycorrhiza. So as a matter of fact, mycorrhiza do influence the interactions with weeds at the root level. And here you see that when weeds are grown together with sunflower, obviously they produce much less biomass because there is competition between weeds and crop, but still, when mycorrhiza are added to the pot, the biomass of the wheat species is lower, about 40% lower than the case in which you have competition with wheat and sunflower, but you are not adding mycorrhiza to the substrate. So indeed, it is true that mycorrhiza can play a potential interesting role. So this needs to be further explored, and we actually investigated it in subsequent studies. But the purpose here is just to demonstrate that what we are seeing here as an effect is just a biofunctionality effect. It's just the presence of mycorrhiza which is giving the service, which means reduction in the biomass of the weeds, and not the diversity, because you see that whether you're using the first, second, or third species, or all the species of mycorrhiza together doesn't really make a difference in terms of biomass of the weeds. So this is why I call this a biofunctionality better. That clear enough? Second case, an example of functional identity. This is related to an experiment that was part of a PhD project done on organically grown maize as part of a long-term experiment that we had at the experimental station of the University of Pisa. And what is the idea here? So the idea was that if we increase both the genetic and the species diversity in a maize-based cropping system, this would provide a more favorable environment for a mycorrhiza, and in turn, this will increase the early growth of the crop of maize. So, what do we mean by genetic and species diversity in this specific case? By genetic diversity, we compare 5 different genotypes, some classical conventional hybrids, some hybrids grown or developed under organic farming conditions, and some free, specifically composite cross population. So the idea is similar to what I explained for wheat. There is a further difficulty in maize because maize is an open pollinated crop. So you have to be careful when you're growing this type of genetic material, because otherwise you have an intermingling of all different traits carried by the pollen of different species. But in theory, it is possible to create composite crop population also in maize. And this has been done, for example, in Hungary, in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. They are working a lot on breeding on cereals, and including these types of species. That's for genetic diversity. And why was this interesting in this specific case? Because there are papers suggesting that with modern breeding, so with the usage of modern hybrids, maize, a crop like maize, might have lost the ability of establishing effective symbiosis with mycorrhiza. So that's why we wanted to test if we could turn back to a more genetically diverse type of cultivar, if we could actually turn back this type of effect. In terms of species diversity, we grow different type of cover crops before maize. We had hairy vetch, legume, Brassica juncea, and cruciferous cover crop, a mixture of 7 different species. So that was a higher level of diversity within the cover crop. element and a control without cover crop. There was an additional hypothesis that we had that if we would increase higher genetic and species diversity, the colonization of maize roots by mycorrhiza would be higher, and therefore this would have benefited the crop. Results. Here you see the effect of the different type of cover crops grown before maize on the percentage mycorrhizal colonization of maize roots. Maize which was grown after the crop. Right? So you see that the best cover crop in order to develop a higher colonization rate of mycorrhiza is the legume heritage. Significantly higher than the mixture of 7 cover crop species, and much higher than the control and the brassica species. This is not a surprise because if any of you works with mycorrhiza, you should know that brassica species are not a family which can establish effective symbiosis with mycorrhiza. It is pretty well known. So, indeed, a high level of mycorrhizal colonization is positive in the sense that it does stimulate initial higher biomass rate of maize. But here, what we are seeing is a functional identity effect. Why? Because the best treatment is not the more diverse, where we had a mixture of 7 species of cover crops, but the treatment in which there is a legume, which, as a matter of fact, is traits which are more conducive to establishing effective symbiosis with mycorrhiza. So, for this specific purpose, it's more important to choose the best cover crop species rather than a more diverse cover crop species. So this is what we call a functional identity effect. Nevertheless, generally, we can say that including the cover crop before growing maize is positive anyway. But it could be even more positive if you choose the right type of cover crop with the right mix. Okay, so that's the idea. And so there is no species diversity effect, but a species identity effect for the cover crops, and for the genetic diversity, we actually did not detect any significant difference. So whether we were using a hybrid or a composite cross population, the level of mycorrhizal colonization was pretty much the same. Last case, then I'm going to the conclusions, don't worry, I want to abuse your patience. Here, another PhD project from Marzia, a former PhD student of mine. Here, the idea was to create what we call functional mixtures of cover crops to be used in a no-till organic vegetable system in which aubergine, eggplant, was the crop that we were growing, and consider that organic no-till in organic condition has for many years considered to be nearly impossible because of the difficulty of controlling weeds. Well, this is not necessarily the case, or at least there are ways of improving the situation. So this was the aim of the study. So we hypothesized that if we created mixtures based on a high number of species, we would improve weed suppression. So weed suppression was the target service that we were focusing on. And we also hypothesized that if we would create these mixtures not just by increasing randomly the number of species, but by deliberately selecting those species in terms of the traits that they have, right? Traits that can carry to the weed suppression, better weed suppression effect, we will have an even better result. So basically, we screened initially all the possible cover crop species that we could use in such a system. And this is not an easy job because there is not a specific breeding program for cover crops. nowhere in the world, I would say. Now, in some breeding companies are starting to work on it, but still very little. So what did we do? We basically understood that by looking at orange species, right, so they might possess traits that would make them useful also as cover crop species, right, especially when combined. So that's what we screened: different potential cover crop species, different varieties. This is a catalog field, right, that was grown for a couple of years in order to measure the traits, right, of these cover crops. What kind of traits are relevant in this case? So we are in an organic farming condition. If we can make a cover crop better to suppress weeds in a system in which we cannot use herbicide, is of course an important thing, right? But it is also important in an organic farming system to provide nitrogen through the use of cover. So we had these two target services that we wanted to develop. So the initial screening was done in such a way to measure traits like early growth, growth habitus, root development, and allelopathic potential from the point of view of the set of traits which are potentially interesting for improving weed suppression, and the nitrogen catching or nitrogen fixation ability with an obvious focus on legumes from the point of view of the other service, like the nitrogen provision service. So we made a series of growth chamber trials, field screening trials in order to measure these traits. And in the end, we understood, for example, in the group of legumes, that there were two subgroups with opposite characteristics. So here you see plant height, shoot dry weight, and root dry weight. And there were two legume species among which those that we tried, specifically field pea and vetch, which had completely different trait measures compared to, for example, to clover. Talking about legumes, right? So these allowed us little by little to identify the potential functional groups that we could use to create the cover crop mixtures. And in the end, we ended up with 4 functional groups: large seeded legumes like pea and vetch, small seeded legumes like these 2 species of trifolium, 2 grasses, and 2 brassica species. And here you see the functional traits that are possessed by the species within each functional group. So, for example, large seeded legumes, of course, they are legumes, so they fix nitrogen. They can grow quite well in height, and they have a binding habitus. And this is different compared to the small seeded legume functional group, which also, of course, is able to fix nitrogen, but it doesn't grow very high, but it's able to cover the soil horizontally quite quickly and quite effectively. So from the point of view of weed suppression, this is also an interesting thing. So we took this into consideration. And they also have a deep root system, etc., right? So I'm going step by step just to let you understand what was the process behind the construction of these cover crop mixtures. So in the end, we designed different cover crop mixtures, specifically by including 2 levels of diversity. One level given just by the number of species in the cover crop, 2 species mixtures, 4 species mixtures, and 8 species mixtures, so all 8 species together. The second level of diversity was a functional biodiversity gradient related to the number of functional groups included in the mixture. So, for example, if you have a 2 species cover crop mixture, these 2 species can belong to the same functional group, like the 2 species of clover, or they can belong to 2 different functional groups. 1 small seeded legume plus 1 brassica, 1 small seeded legume plus 1 grass, 1 large seeded legume plus 1 grass. So we could combine different opportunities in it, as well as in the 4 species and 8 species. So this is a 3.5 year series of trials that I'm synthesizing. Okay, this is just the the management, the agronomic management. We grew the cover crop, and then in the end we used a special type of roller crimper. You know what a roller crimper is? It's a special type of roll aimed to squeeze and prevent the regrowth of the bone. It's becoming very interesting, especially under organic management conditions, but not just in this case. Then we applied flame weeding after rolling. What was the purpose of flame weeding? To further prevent the regrowth of the cover crops. Because if they regrow, they grow back. When you have aubergine in the early stage, they will become as weeds. It will behave as weeds. So basically, flame weeding here has the purpose of glyphosate in a conventional system. So if you have no-till cover crop system, you would usually spray glyphosate to prevent the cover crops to grow back. Here you are in an organic condition. Of course, you cannot use glyphosate. So you can use a combination of the roller, crimper, and flame weeding to try to get the same goal. So these are in the next two slides, the last two slides before the conclusion, the synthesis of the 3.5 years of trial. So here you see the relationship in terms of with biomass, total with biomass in the cover crop species versus the number of species in the cover crop mixture or the number of functional groups in the cover crop mixture. So you say the same type of relationship. The more diversity you have in the cover crop, the better it is from the point of view of reduction of weight biomass. Pay attention that this is the log scale. So every difference of 1 is a difference of 10 times, actually, right? So you can see this kind of trend. So both very similar trend. If you actually look at the coefficient of regression here, you see that you have a slightly better effect in terms of unit reduction of weeds when you are applying a functional perspective to the creation of cover. You're not just increasing the number of species per se in the cover crop mixture, you are increasing this number of species based on a functional perspective. And similar effects with a different pattern in terms of the other target surface. Here expressed as the percentage of biologically fixed nitrogen in the cover crop. But some cover crop, well, all cover crops, most of them have legumes, right? Is the diversity in the cover crop determining a better efficiency of biological nitrogen fixation from the legumes that are included in the mixture? It seems to be the case. You see that the more species or the more the number of functional groups in cover crop mixture, the higher the percentage of biologically fixed nitrogen in the cover crop, which is an indicator of efficiency of the cover crop of the legumes in the cover crop mixture. You can also see by the trend of these graphs that there is an optimum level in terms of number of species and number of functional groups. So the 4 species cover crops composed by 3 functional groups is probably the optimal situation. This is important to mention because some farmers are a bit reluctant of increasing overly the diversity in a cover crop species from the point of view of management and from the point of view of cost. So if you can capture the best compromise, this is always important from practical point of view. And again, slightly better results when we are creating cover crop mixtures based on a functional approach and just by the number of species. So, some concluding remarks. Try to sum up a bit of the many information, hopefully not too many, that I've given today. So, indeed, agricultural diversification is an important lever for sustainability, and there are more and more papers and studies that are demonstrating this. Functional agrobiodiversity, as we are approaching it, as defined, has the potential to contribute to our system resilience and stability. especially so in more difficult environmental conditions and in low input conditions, right? There could be cases in which you don't have access to external inputs, like in Africa, for example. And that's where playing with agrobiodiversity becomes particularly important. So you can buffer the lack of use or availability of, for example, nitrogen fertilizers or other type of inputs with the proper use combination of agrobiodiversity methods. Or this could be voluntary, like in organic farming or other type of agroecological farming. You do want to reduce the usage of external inputs. So the best way to maintain productivity in this type of situation is to diversify your system. I will say it's the only way, probably, not just the best. You cannot just give up with inputs and leave the system as it is. It won't work. A trait-based or functional approach, in my opinion, in our opinion, facilitates the understanding of the value of agrobiodiversity to really support the transition towards more sustainable and agroecological systems. Nevertheless, there is an important practical issue to be considered: how to engage farmers into this game. Because we are working with many farmers, and some of them are convinced and very open to this. But generally, the question they ask is, are you going to complicate my management system over? I mean, I do believe that what you are saying might work, but if it becomes too complicated for me to manage such a complex system, sorry, but I will just give it. But interesting, but it's not something good for me. So what we are thinking is to somehow identify, for a given context, what we can call a minimum threshold of functional biodiversity that could be implemented in field or in a farm in such a way to obtain the best compromise between obtaining the provision of services without complicating too much the life and the management of farmers. So this is a challenge. It is not necessarily easy, but I think that this would be an interesting level to really push forward this type of approach in the development of new agricultural systems in Europe, but I would say also outside. That's it. Sorry for taking it, dragging it a little bit long.
Muy interesante tu presentación, Paolo. Ahora vamos a dar espacio para las preguntas y para comentarios y discusión. Yo les pido que cada uno que formule una pregunta se presente, diga quién es y por qué trabaja. Marina, querías empezar.
Thank you very much.
Podés hacerlo en español, si querés.
Sí.
Sí, no hay problema.
Bueno, Marina Omasín, profesora de ecología, y trabajo con micorrizas y con otros simbiontes de plantas en agroecosistemas, tanto agrícolas, pero sobre todo de pasturas. Y también cultivo mi cobertura. Y por un lado, me gustó mucho ver que estabas trabajando con ese componente, ese servicio que podrían prestar los hongos microrrízicos. A veces me cuesta este approach de trait-based, porque las micorrizas a veces se atribuye un trait y son múltiples los traits. Y ahí me preguntaba si sus resultados, por un lado, no mostraban un efecto poco considerado de las micorrizas de aumentar la fijación de nitrógeno, un efecto interactivo con los disobios, que por eso las leguminosas tienen esa respuesta. Así que las leguminosas fijan más cuando tienen micorrizas. Y la otra era por qué introducir en los cultivos de cobertura brasitáceas que no son micorrízicas.
Sí. Ok, gracias Marina por su pregunta. Oh, shit, it's better. I think it works for me. Yes, good points. Okay, so the in terms of the effect or potential synergistic effect on mycorrhiza, for example, on legumes, right? So what happens in legumes? I have not shown this data. I showed this yesterday in yesterday's meeting. We are working quite a lot on mycorrhiza in, for example, system with without legumes, with without intercropping. What we are generally seeing is that the way through which agricultural management can promote the mycorrhizal symbiosis, and this could be, for example, through cover crops, or it could also be, as in the other PhD project that I showed yesterday, through the application of liquid vermicompost extract, right? So vermicompost is an earthworm-based compost in the liquid form, which is very rich of fungal and bacterial species, including mycorrhizal species. The synergistic effect or this type of effect works better on non-legume species. Yeah, so for example, sunflower. Sunflower, we observe a fantastic boost, for example, of the application of liquid vermicompost extract, something like 30% more productivity just by applying versus non-applying this extract, right? In the legumes, in some cases, for some legumes, we did observe some positive effects, not every time. So our understanding is that in the case of legumes have more, let's say, weapons in their arsenal, right? Try to cope with soil condition and how to exploit the functionality of the soil. They have mycorrhizal symbiosis, they have rhizobial symbiosis, and they could also through other chemical signals or the release of exudates try to establish a rhizosphere that supports the growth of the plant anyway, right? So it is interesting, nevertheless, to notice that if we have for example, intercropping system in which we have one legume and one non-legume, we can still benefit from the presence of the non-legumes, because the non-legume present typically, for example, stimulates the biologically fixed nitrogen amount from the legume. So there are indeed interactions between the two components, not necessarily easy to understand, unravel, but they are there, right? So our general approach is try to see, not only just to understand what happens above ground and below ground, but also to see if there are some management practices that can boost these type of synergies. It could be application of biostimulants, as I mentioned. It could be a special way of arranging intercropping, right? So we have seen, for example, that a less dense presence of cereals in intercropping facilitates the activity and functionality of legumes as a companion plant. So there are several ways by which we can obtain results. We don't have to forget that the baseline soil conditions are always very important. So whether you're working on a fertile soil or on a less fertile soil, it will determine clearly the incremental magnitude of the effect. I would say that generally, the less fertile soils is where you can more clearly see the benefits associated to this type of synergies rather than the more fertile soil. So this is part of the reason why some farmers say, yes, but we are not seeing a real effect. Okay, but we're starting from baseline conditions which are already quite good. That's probably why you don't see a clear effect. So there are various ways by which you can obtain these results. There is no standard recipe anyway, I would say. And everything needs to be adjusted to the specific local condition or local conditions. And what was the other question? Yes, okay. Yes, because the goal of this PhD project, I mean, the target service was mainly to aim to weed suppression. So we were hypothesizing, as it is commonly known, that some brassicaceae species can have an allelopathic potential, right?
Okay.
So from the point of view of the weed suppression services, these will turn out to be useful. Certainly not from the point of view of the establishment of mycorrhizal symbiosis. It would work. Probably they will have a negative effect against mycorrhizal population. So, but this was not the main goal for this specific study. If the goal was to favorize mycorrhizal symbiosis, we would have that to classification.
Santiago.
Sí, en español. Yo quiero destacar dos cosas del trabajo con mezclas. Uno tiene que ver con un lugar común, un place, donde la gente dice más diversidad, hay más funciones, es mejor. Y no necesariamente.
No.
O sea, podemos tener un número parsimonioso de especies y lograr el mismo. Y eso va con el otro lado, que es del otro lado del mostrador, del usuario, el productor agropecuario, que va a decir, no me compliques la vida, hagamos lo siguiente. Y ahí hay algo muy importante que tiene que ver con el uso de leguminosas, brassicáceas, pasto. Ustedes le están ofreciendo al productor un portfolio, una caja de herramientas, en donde puede sentarse junto con el asesor, con un grupo de productores y decir, necesito mejorar la fertilidad, necesito incorporar carbono, suprimir malezas, la función que sea, y lo puedo hacer parsimoniosamente con ustedes. Para no complicarme la vida, pero simplemente. Entonces, tener opciones siempre es bueno porque uno puede elegir. Pero si no, vicia. No. Entonces me parece que hay que destacar estos dos mensajes. Uno, no necesariamente más diverso mejor. Y por otro lado, es muy bueno tener opciones, tener alternativas para, bueno, esto, en función del objetivo productivo.
Thank you, Santiago. And I want to comment on this because based on our experience, diversity really pays off as an additional gain, an additional effect, when you are in more difficult conditions. Like, for example, you have a difficult season, right? Climatically speaking. That's where biodiversity, a higher level of diversity can compensate from the point of view of the overall performance of a crop or a cover crop. In the best year, probably you can have, there is a limited number of species, for example, that you could include that are giving a good amount of service anyway, right? You don't necessarily have to look for the highest possible level of diversity. So this is an effect that we have seen in many crops and in many situations. So this also means what is the purpose? What is the main goal, right? So you want to implement a system which is more resilient against climate change. So you're not really interested in obtaining the highest possible yield, but you want to obtain a more stable yield. Then play with diversity. Then it's where, for this specific type of goal, is where diversity can really help you. If you're instead looking at the ultimate or the optimum type of solution, then it could as well be that a limited number of species work better than a higher number of species. And I agree with you that this is probably a message that could be given to farmers to calm them down. Say, wait, we are not here to extremely complicate your life. So we are here just to, as you say, provide tools, right? Potential solutions, and then it's up to you, depending on your specific objective, to decide which one you want to combine or what you want to try. The important message from our perspective, I think, is to clarify that there are solutions that might work. Right? It's not that to say this solution has to be implemented anyway in any type of system because it really works like this. But biodiversity can offer a range of important solutions, technical solutions. Then, of course, it's left to the objectives, priorities, and attitudes of the individual farmers. There are some farmers which are more keen to diversify the system than others. That's perfectly fine, right? That's part of the game. But what is interesting, and this is actually what we're doing more and more in research, is to sit together with farmers at the very beginning, say, and define step by step with them what are the goals, what do they want to get, and consequently, what is the type of diversity that might be more interesting to them to implement in the system. Consider that these type of studies are relatively young, because until 1990, there was basically no study on agriculture and biodiversity. And after the release of the Convention on Biological Diversity in 92, and even more so after 2005, with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, that's where the concept of ecosystem services in relation to agricultural management really started to become common or interesting. The concept of functional, also the usage of the term functional biodiversity in agro-ecosystem is still quite vague. We wrote a chapter in a book we edited a few years ago, and we're tracing the development of the literature on the subject, and basically the papers in the Scopus database using a combination of agriculture and functional biodiversity are something like 0.002% of the total number of papers published in a year on agriculture, and is fluctuating a bit, but not showing a clear trend. Whereas the combination of agriculture and ecosystem services is showing a very clear increase in trend. So this type of approaches are, I find them fascinating as a subject of research, but also I find it fascinating because it can really provide practical solutions to implement and improve systems. Of course, I will never go to a farmer and use terms like functional biodiversity or ecosystem services. I will use proxies, but in the end, you can always translate that what they're saying or what they want to implement in your own scientific jargon. Yeah, that's what I would say.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Comentario? ¿No? ¿Vos? Vale.
No, no, quería agregar que no estoy muy segura de ese plató con un mensaje de que hay redundancia o que hay un límite de la diversidad, porque no caemos otra vez en pedir que el servicio es el rendimiento o que no estamos viendo beneficios como por ejemplo el mantenimiento del rendimiento frente a sequía o frente a eventos más raros. Entonces me parece que está bien tener eso, pero no creer que la diversidad siempre muestra sus beneficios y que eso se va a trasladar el rendimiento. Yo no, digamos, creo que estamos acá en nuestro país, por ejemplo, viviendo periodos de sequía, o bueno, el cambio global nos puede mostrar que ahí es cuando la diversidad puede tener otro papel.
No, I think that, yes, difficult to say what should be the right message to deliver, right? Certainly, generally speaking, the more diversity you have, the better it is, at least from the point of view of buffering unpredictable effects. Right? Yes, because the type of graphs that I showed, as I guess you know, they are resembling very classical, theoretical relationships linking biodiversity with expression of service. And this is interesting to notice that these type of, say, curvilinear relationships are quite frequent, right? In natural and even in agricultural ecosystems. I don't think that the message should always be, okay, let's take it to the minimum limit, right? Because if we are dealing with farmers that are willing, more, say, innovative, so let's push it to the other limits, right? The upper limit of diversity. So I think that this is the area between the plateau and the end point is the operational space in which we should place ourselves, depending on what farmers perceive and what they are asking. But the very minimum should be to reach the plateau, I think. Right? Not always easy to identify, but yeah. But you know, in Europe there is already, even though there are a lot of subsidies for this type of agricultural management systems, there is still resistance, as you may imagine, from some agricultural lobbies or producers. And there is right now a discussion on which the European Commission wants to make it compulsory to have a minimum degree of diversity in crop rotation, so minimum crop rotation, in order to access the basic level of subsidies. So if you're just growing soybean after soybean after soybean, or wheat after wheat after wheat, forget about asking for European money. And I think this is, I think it's good, because this money is important for all farmers. So it's, I think it's a good starting point to try and start to think how I can start to diversify my system, because otherwise we will never be able to reach these goals of cutting down pesticides by 50% by 2030. Probably we would never be able to reach these quantitative goals just 7 years from now. But if the trend is there, I think it's already important. Right? What is interesting to notice is that, for example, even European pesticide or chemical companies are starting to understand that the wind has changed with Europe. So they are developing, for example, production sectors for biostimulants or natural herbicides, or this kind of products, right? Because they know that standard chemical pesticide will
it's the same. Yeah, I think it's the same. Santiago.
What about the range, the optimum range of action? Economical, because the farmers do gross margin and and you say, well, you should use 6 species. Okay, phase. Because the seed is not cheap, and if you pay for these, then they will make the numbers that they decide. Which is the benefit of invest money every year, or we spend money every year in $1. And the other is time. We need time, we need empirical evidence, experiments of at least 70 years to see the effect of stability or the effect of resilience. We have a drought period of 3 years, and the resilience is the amount of response, the rate of response after a period of stress or water deficit. Then we need more experiments in the long term to well, this is stable, how stable? Well, 5 years or 7, here she reasonable period. Yeah. So the amount of response after about 6 years.
Yeah, that's true. That's very much true. And in terms of the economic return associated to the diversification strategies, it is true that if you diversify more, if you create a mixture, especially if you create it on your own, if you don't buy a pre-built cover crop mixture, this might be costly. But again, it depends on, it might become a substantial cost for an arable farmer if the idea is to every year grow a cover crop in between the main crop and 2 main crops. For perennial farmers, we are also working in perennial cropping system like vineyards or olive groves. Yeah, there the situation is probably better from the point of view of the acceptability of farmers, because if you are in a perennial cropping system, the best choice would be choosing a perennial cover crop species or perennial or a mixture of perennial species, because once you have planted it, it's just a matter of managing it, and you find it every year, right? So this already it's an important element to convince farmers that it's worth the effort, right? Let alone any possible estimates related to the effect of a plant cover on the reduction of erosion and other loss of soil fertilities, which might happen, especially in perennial systems. In annual systems, it could be tricky just because of the actual cost, right? But nevertheless, there are intermediate situations, right? So if you have livestock, for example, right, you can also play with a perennial or pluriennial crop included in a crop rotation, which from an economic point of view somehow will buffer the yearly cost of introducing this solution, because you are spreading it over higher number of years, right? Yes, there is no golden rule, I would say, yes. But those solutions work. In the European situation, there is, of course, the side advantage that if you choose to implement this solution, you are paid. So you have a subsidy. You can ask, right? Not just the basic subsidy, you can have an additional subsidy. And in the present common agricultural policy, we can combine different types of subsidies in order to make a step-by-step process towards a higher diversification level of the process. So this is encouraging, or at least is reducing a bit the doubts from a farmer's point of view that these solutions might not pay off from an economic point of view. And yeah, this is exactly the very reason for introducing this type of subsidies. Okay. We will pay, right, for you. You don't have to worry. If your yield is reduced, you will have a compensation for the yield loss. But as we have seen, not necessarily. You will have a yield loss. That will be even better, because they are not asking you back the money for the subsidies. If this is the case, you will keep it anyway. And this would be a further reason for going along this pathway. But it takes time, because you know that there is always resistance and doubts, but I think that this evidence, and especially when these evidence are coming from research which is done directly in farmers' fields, are the best to try to really entail transition in this direction.
Por ejemplo, alternancia indirecta, no líderes. En los primeros años de adopción, los productores se han bastante fertilizantes, tengo que usar más herbicidas, pero después cuando el sistema se estabilizó, se dio cuenta que estaban ahorrando gasol, que estaban ahorrando los tiempos relativos. Entonces, sí, en los 4 o 7 años que me poní para implementar la cinta directa, agarro.
And tomorrow, or not imagine if tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, I'm going to show you data from another. We find it a very important evidence that we have found from 3 years of trial in the farmers' field, in which we were able to demonstrate that the right combination between overcrop patch, in this case, roller crimping, passed at the right time, in the no-till system, can allow to eliminate the use of glyphosate, making the crop productive and even economically more rewarding than when you're using glyphosate. So this is because, you know, the classical criticism, yes, they could theoretically work about how about the yield, or how about the economy? Well, we have demonstrated, I'm going to show you tomorrow or Friday, that it is possible if you find the right combination between ecological knowledge, which means when you should grow the cover crop, now how much biomass the cover crop produces, and how it will react to the rolling, and the usage of a very simple tool, which is the roller crimper. In this case, the roller crimper was built by the farmer himself. Right? Because you can find the blueprints in the internet, in the website of the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, and you can, if you have a minimum skill, you can build it on your own. So there is not even more the excuse that, okay, this system works, but you have to pay 20,000 euro more for buying a specific machine. No. So, this is to contradict some mantras that are still quite common also in Europe, that if you are going in a no-till system, you cannot get rid of glyphosate. You may know that there is an ongoing discussion, a very important one in Europe, about the renewal or not renewal to the use of glyphosate. It will probably be renewed, not clear for how many years. They say 10 years, yes. I predict that there might be some restrictions anyway. So maybe it will be difficult that they decide all of a sudden, okay, let's stop the use of glyphosate. This will have important consequences, not just for European farmers, but also for Argentina farmers as well, and any farmers who are importing their produce into Europe, right? So let's see what happens. But I mean, we just wanted to show that it is scientifically and technically possible to get rid of glyphosate through an appropriate combination of ecological and technical. And that's it. There was no specific political message behind it. Even though this paper created a little bit of fuss, as you may imagine. Yes.
¿Alguien más quiere hacer alguna pregunta?
No, just a comment about this variability that you analyzed, then ecological, physical, sustainability, but maybe not economic sustainability, which needs to put subsidies to compensate.
Okay, in the case of the glyphosate trial, what the journal has just explained, the economic calculation was done without adding the subsidies. So the system was economically viable even without including the subsidies. So since you can also add the subsidies if you get rid of glyphosate, that should be even more encouraging to farmers. Yes, it's a win-win situation. But we were looking for a solution which could work regardless of the subsidy, because otherwise this would have been a very easy excuse. Okay, good, but if you don't have the subsidies, it wouldn't work. It's not necessarily true. And so I think this is just to encourage researchers that with this type of approach, I believe you can find interesting solutions adapted to the different situations, growing conditions. That not saying that what we have discovered can be transferred as such in a situation like Argentina. So, but I think that the approach can be adjusted to any type of situation. This is actually what we're doing, because we have through this international project, we are applying pretty much the same concept in Madagascar, in Ethiopia, and so that's also fascinating. See, okay, we think this approach could work. Of course, the situation in Africa, also socio-economic one, is completely different, and we need to take this into account before starting. But there's still good for developing the technical solution which might work. So, yeah, that's it. Anyway, if anyone is interested in my presentations, they're going to be or in the background papers, just let me know.
Hoy en la tarde, a las 3 de la tarde, en la sala de profesores, vamos a tener una reunión con aquellos que estén interesados en charlar un poquito más acerca de su trabajo. Creo que entre las 3 y las 5 más o menos en la sala de profesores de pabellón central. Probablemente algunos de ustedes quieran interactuar un poco más. Aprovechar charlas informales. Bueno, muchas gracias, Paola. Muy interesante. Gracias a todos los que vinieron por las preguntas y comentarios muy interesantes también. Nos vemos.
Bueno, gracias.
Paolo, un placer conocer.
Yo creo que conocí en 2006.
Puede ser, ¿no? Ah,
Vení por el taller
Sí.
de universidad.
sí, perfecto. Hizo contigo de glifosato y micorriza. Puede ser. Yo tengo estudios, dirigí un estudiante,
Puede ser.
el efecto del glifosato sobre la diversidad y abundancia en micorriza.
¿Conoce el grupo de Manuela Giornetti?
Sí, sí. Bueno, trato de ir a los congresos del simbiosis de micorriza, la escucho a
Es el
Manuela.
grupo en-
Sí, y a Marcel Van der Steen también. Bueno, tú estás con ella, con Jabonet.
yo trabajo con ellos regularmente. Ellos son de la Universidad de Pisa y de Santana, de la misma ciudad.
Te quería contar si podemos pensar algo de futuro. Hoy no puedo ir a la tarde. Yo trabajo con Rey Grasa anual, ¿no? Maleza de trigo.
Sí.
Y